Sunday's opener was a tale of two halves for the Seahawks, especially on the offensive line when it came to protecting Geno Smith. Are they facing potentially season-destroying concerns up front with some of the moves they're looking to make from free agency? With Abraham Lucas and Charles Cross being banged up, we're going to be investigating problematic pass protection for the Seahawks here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Moscow, Idaho, or down in Sao Paulo, Brazil. We greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Unfortunately, we don't have a victory Monday to open the 2023 season. It's a misery Monday, a very miserable one. Rob, if you're like me, I've went back and I've watched this game from yesterday 3 times, and that was kind of a mind-numbing experience. But through the good and the bad, you have to analyze what happened. Look at the positives. Look at the negatives, plenty of those coming out of yesterday's game. We'll be dishing out our Monday musings. We'll be tackling your questions in our weekly mailbag segment and much more. So again, special thanks to all the 12s, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Let's get to it. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Seattle went into halftime of its season opener against the Los Angeles Rams with a 13-7 lead. Geno Smith had only been pressured 2 times in the entire first half. He was in control, completing over 70% of his passes. Ken Walker III had a good half running the football. That's really where the positives ended for the Seahawks, though, unfortunately. And the biggest storyline that really created the unraveling in the second half for Seattle's offense, both of their starting tackles, Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas, exiting with injuries early in the second half. And from that point, I know Geno Smith took the sword, as any admirable quarterback will after the game. But anybody that watched this game, Rob, knows that this was out of Geno Smith's control in the second half. There was literally nothing Seattle's offense could do because the offensive line absolutely self-destructed, not just with the backup tackles in, but it felt like the entire rest of the line started to struggle, and they just couldn't run an offense in yesterday's second half.
Yeah, Corbin, I think that's very well put. The reality is that football can be a very complicated game. I think that Sunday's performance against the Rams showed how simple it can be. The Seahawks have 2 very good young tackles, and once they lost them, everything fell apart. As you said, the offense only gave up 2 pressures to Geno Smith in the first half, but, they were essentially a turnstile in the second half with Stone Forsythe at left tackle replacing Charles Cross, Jake Curran at right tackle replacing Abraham Lucas. And of course, we all know that, you're only a play away from getting onto the field. But the reality is that the Seahawks had created their entire game plan, really their entire season plan, with the expectation that they were going to have these 2 young stars that had proven themselves durable a year ago at the tackle positions. The Seahawks started off the game. They had 4 drives. All of them should have resulted in points. Of course, there was the missed field goal at the end of the first half by Jason Myers, but that would have netted them 16 points. A year ago, they scored 17 points to beat the Denver Broncos. So they, in just a half, would have been within 1 point of what they scored in the entire game in a victory over the Broncos a year ago. So to me, that really is the story. It really is that simple. Was Geno Smith dynamic in this game? No. But as you said, it's pretty difficult to do so when you don't have any kind of pass protection. Was Seattle's running game very good? No. Because again, you don't have the offensive tackles, and that's going to create all kinds of confusion in the interior of the offensive line. And then, as one might expect, fact, when the offense can't do anything except punt the ball after 3 downs, the defense is going to get gassed. Frankly, I was surprised the Seahawks didn't give up more points to the LA Rams because Matthew Stafford played like the young, strong-arm Matthew Stafford that was the number 1 overall pick all those years ago, that won a Super Bowl just 2 seasons ago. And the Seahawks basically just got beaten because 2 of the most critical players on the field, unfortunately, were lost. And that, to me, is the huge storyline here. Is this could be a game that the Seahawks rebound from if they're able to get their 2 tackles back in place. But if that's not the case, then this could be kind of the beginning of an end, or the beginning of a very long season for the Seahawks. Because, again, if you don't have those 2 tackles in place, the formidable pass rushers that they're going to be seeing the rest of the season, including this week on the road in Detroit against like Aiden Hutchinson, et cetera, it could be ugly if the Seahawks don't right the ship here quickly.
I don't like to play the I told you so card, but I remember talking about this a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago when roster cuts were getting ready to happen. Robin, I think you were in agreement with me that, everybody's talking about the defensive line, but I felt like with how poorly Stone Forsythe and Jay Curhan played throughout the preseason and just seeing what they looked like on the training camp practice field, that was a glaring hole to me. The drop off from your starting tackles to the backups is as wide of a gap as there is on this entire roster, any position group. And we got to see that play out yesterday. Now, in Stone Forsythe's defense, he was much better than Jay Curhan. He gave up 1 pressure on 8 pass pro reps. Curhan gave up 4 on 9 pass blocking reps, so almost 50%. And to put this into perspective, Rob, this coming from Rich, I think it's Hariber, who is from Sharp Football Analysis. Geno Smith was 13 for 18, 0 sacks taken on 19 dropbacks with Cross and Lucas in the game. 3 for 6 for 9 yards, 2 sacks, and a 50% pressure rate on second half dropbacks. Now, that is a very small sample size because the Seahawks had 1 first down the entire second half, and it came from a defensive pass interference penalty. They did not actually pick up a first down without being aided by the Rams the entire second half. It was a Michael Dixon punt fest. But the reason that was happening is because Seattle literally could not run offense. They couldn't run the ball. They ran the ball well in the first half. They couldn't get back to it, though, because they were not able to sustain drives. And Geno Smith literally had no time to breathe or even blink his eye after the snap without multiple Rams players being in the backfield. And so the offensive line really faltered without their 2 bookends and really made it impossible for them to run any offense. And I'll talk about it a little later. There were some things I think Seattle could have done to help with that situation that they didn't do, but it still was an extremely bad situation because of the lack of depth. And for that reason, they're showing the confidence that they have in the 2 tackles that are in their backup positions right now, because they're going to be bringing in a 41-year-old Jason Peters for a visit tomorrow. Pete Carroll didn't confirm the visit, but he said that they have talked to Jason Peters. He is coming out tomorrow. All the sources that I've talked to, they're bringing him in. There's a legitimate interest. And I know kicking the tires on a 41-year-old tackle might not seem like a great thing, but Jason Peters is a future Hall of Famer. And even though he's nowhere near the player he was at one point, he's still a serviceable tackle. And there aren't very many of those on the free agent market this early in the season.
There's a couple. You mentioned Jason Peters, Taylor Lewan, a former first-round pick, former All-Pro with the Tennessee Titans. It had been reported that he had retired. He has not retired, so that might be somebody to kind of keep in mind. Brandon Parker, Eric Fisher, Juwan James, Jamarco Jones. And again, this is one of the things, one of the real benefits, one of the reasons why I don't think that the sky is falling down just yet, is that the Seahawks, by benefit of being 0-1 right now, are going to have some waiver opportunities, and they can pluck any practice squad player out there and put them perhaps on their own active roster. And so that's something they should be taking advantage of. John Schneider talked about this before. He has kind of noticed the lack of big body talented guys that are available on the practice squad. There are some pretty solid ones out there. So I would not be surprised, with all due respect to Jason Peters, he is not the only option that the Seahawks have at this point. I would expect them to be kicking the tires, so to speak, on a lot of veteran tackles. And then also, of course, hoping that Charles Cross and Abe Lucas might be, as Pete Carroll said, day to day, perhaps able to make it back sooner rather than later.
I think something else that has to be considered here, based on what we heard from Pete Carroll today. He said that both these tackles are day-to-day, Cross with a sprained toe, the sprained big toe, and Abraham Lucas, it's not even an injury, according to Pete Carroll. It's just a patellar tendon that flares up sometimes. It bugged him last year. They've had scans on it. There's nothing that needs done. There's no injury that needs repaired or anything, but it's flared up occasionally, and it happened in this season opener. They're hoping they can get these guys back quickly, but they've got some work to do, and there is some concern. So I think something else needs to be considered here. They want to have somebody that is a Hall of Fame caliber player just in the locker room that can provide guidance for these two young tackles, even when they get back. So Jason Peters is the guy last year. He started on practice squad for the Cowboys and then got elevated. He gave up 1 sack on over 130 pass blocking reps, 11 pressures. He wasn't elite, but again, he's still serviceable. And the guy's been through it. He's been playing for almost 2 decades. He has seen everything. So who better to have in your locker room? And these other guys, Stone Forsythe and Jake Curhan, who better to have around you than a player like Jason Peters that you can learn from, that has been through the rigors in the trenches, that has played in Super Bowls. That is the kind of guy you want to bring in. So all the other names you mentioned, they might want to bring in a couple of these guys right now if both their starting tackles truly are going to be potentially missing at least a game or two. But we'll have to wait and see. Right now, Jason Peters is that first name we've seen out there. And I think the experience, the mentorship aspect, and just the fact that he wants to play and he's willing to play for practice squad money. I mean, he just wants to play football at this stage of his career. So I'm interested to see what happens on that front. He still looked like a decent player last year, not what he used to be, but he's still a solid player even at 41 years of age. So worth seeing where that ends up going. When we come back, we are going to tackle your questions on our Monday mailbag segment off of Twitter as well as YouTube. Don't go away. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks, which is brought your way by our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. When I was a site manager, LinkedIn Jobs was my go-to to post writing positions to land top candidates, and they made the process easy and seamless. All you have to do is create your job post and then add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word you're hiring. They've got simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates with the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedInNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedInNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the special 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Tomorrow, it's going to be our first Tell the Truth Tuesday of the 2023 season. And there may be some pretty harsh truths coming out of this game on Sunday, and maybe there'll be some surprising positives. We'll have to wait and see, but you won't want to miss it. Make sure that you are listening in. Let's get to our mailbag segment, shall we? Plenty of questions coming from the 12s after yesterday's loss to the Rams. Let's get to our first one here, Rob, coming from DPanky827 on Twitter. Obviously, the missed field goal at the end of the first half was draining, but do you believe the incomplete deep fade pass to DK Metcalf on 3rd and short was the biggest play of the game, since the Rams had all the momentum starting the second half with a 5-minute touchdown drive?
I think that was certainly a huge play in the game. To me, it was just the consistency with which Matthew Stafford was able to throw the ball. I don't know if there was any one play that really changed it. Maybe when I saw Charles Cross, on the sidelines, would be the moment in the game that I thought changed everything. And again, because it was both Charles Cross as well as Abe Lucas that went down for the Seahawks. But to me, the most frustrating element of it was watching Puka Nacua, a player who I'm very, very high on, but still his ability to get open and show a rapport with Matthew Stafford that looked like it was Cooper Kupp out there. That to me was the most frustrating element. And it was the combination of Seattle's inability to slow down the Stafford-Nacua combination, as well as Seattle's inability to provide any kind of pass protection. One of my best friends, literally the father of my godson, was at this game with his wife. And at halftime, when I saw that Charles Cross was out of this game, I told him to go home. I was like, this game is over. It's done. You can sit around and have a good time if you want, but the Seahawks are not mounting a comeback in this point. So that, of course, occurred after the big fade pass that our listener, and as you said, Corbin, always thank you to all of you. That occurred after that. That to me was a defining point in this game that led to the Seahawks loss.
I mentioned this yesterday, and most of the time I wouldn't have said that this play really jumped out to me, but it did feel like the body language on Seattle's sideline changed significantly when they did not get points after that blocked field goal by Jaron Reed. Yeah. It just seemed like that kind of took the sails out of them a little bit, and then you lose both your tackles right away early in the second half. That really was the lead domino to me, was that missed field goal from just 39 yards out. You got a first down after starting at the 42. You were almost in the red zone, did not get any points there. I think it was deflating. Now, teams need to be able to overcome stuff like that. Sure. So I'm not saying that that's okay or acceptable, but it did look to me like that was the first domino that really dropped, and then you get the injuries, and then the defense can't get stops, and everything just snowballed. But I think the original snowball was that missed field goal, at least yesterday. That's the way I felt watching that game. It just seemed the way the guys reacted on the sideline. Next question from M1KA96. Do you think Bobby Wagner would be willing to let Brooks play the mic if the team thinks that would help? Or maybe he even says so himself if he would recognize it on film. So I'm just going to say this before I even answer the question. I do not think Bobby Wagner was the problem yesterday. Now, you can make the argument that maybe the Seahawks were not maximizing where his coverage skills are at now, and they were putting him in some tough spots, and the Rams were getting all those 15, 20-yard crossers. And, of course, the linebackers, they have the responsibility to do that. But Bobby Wagner had 19 tackles, and he had 9 tackles that netted 2 or fewer yards in this game. You would have given up 50 points in this game if Bobby Wagner wasn't playing out there. So I think the argument that you need to move him around or you need to start rotating Devin Bush in with him, no, I am not buying that, at least right now. And Bobby Wagner would say, I had 19 tackles in this game, and it wasn't like he was making all of them 20 yards downfield. Again, he made a lot of impact plays in this game. So you can look at the coverage. He and Jordan Brooks were pretty similar with their coverage numbers. And I think the Seahawks schematically could have done a lot to help both those guys too, knowing what the Rams like to do. And yet they didn't make those adjustments. More on that later. Next question here coming on our mailbag. Mike C. from NJ on Twitter. It seems like the Seahawks have zero creativity in their blitz packages. That has to change when Adams returns, right?
I think it will be more aggressive when Adams returns. I think that the Seahawks were kind of playing a little bit on their heels because I don't think that they expected Matthew Stafford to come out throwing the ball as effectively as he did. I don't think that Seattle had thought that that the LA Rams receiving core would be as effective as they were. I think that their plan, I believe, was basically to be able to play off a little bit. I think that they thought that they would be able to get to a big lead on the Rams and be able to kind of suffocate Stafford, so to speak. And it just didn't obviously work out that way. And then again, once they lost their tackles, I think the Seahawks basically, and I don't want to say this like they folded their tent and gave up. I think that they recognized that they were very likely to lose this game. And so therefore, why show your hand when you are going to, you're just starting week 1. So don't show everything that you've got in a losing effort. Instead, hold off, lick your wounds a little bit after this week, give a little bit of credit to an LA Rams team. Again, it's just 2 years removed from winning the Super Bowl. And, and hopefully when you get Jamal Adams back, we get Devin Witherspoon back, hopefully you're able to resuscitate what should be a good pass rush, but certainly was not against the LA Rams on Sunday.
Our next question from ID Storyteller on Twitter. Why was Dre Jones completely a non-factor? Look, he was a complete non-factor in this game. I think there was one play that I saw him kind of swipe by Matthew Stafford rushing the passer. He did absolutely nothing in this game. He was a complete non-factor. If you would have told me he didn't play, I might have been able to say, oh, I didn't see him out there. That's the way that it felt. But in his defense, it kind of goes off that last question. I just felt like this was a very vanilla game plan defensively by Seattle. And maybe it was because they thought, well, Matthew Stafford's coming off an injury. They're missing Cooper Kupp. We can get by with more basic stuff. Look, this is the NFL, and look who's on the other sideline. Sean McVay, the mad experimenter himself. You got to have your eggs in a row, or he is going to carve you up with his play calling, especially when Stafford's slinging the ball the way he did yesterday. So I didn't think they did enough up front to help their guys be able to create some pressure and give the Rams credit. I mean, Steve Avila, the rookie out of TCU, he did a fantastic job at this game. I thought Ankrum played well, the other guard spot. I mean, give the Rams credit. They locked Seattle's defensive line down. I thought that was an area Seattle would have an advantage in this game, and it proved not to be the case. And that allowed Matthew Stafford to have the success that he did, slinging the ball all over the place. Our next question for Rob, coming from El Zuzu69 on Twitter. And you and I are going to laugh a little bit at this question because it's been one game, fans. What quarterback will the Seahawks be drafting next year with their top 10 pick?
Well, there are a couple of quarterbacks, just to take the question seriously for a moment. There are a couple of quarterbacks that definitely do look like top 10 picks from now. We're going to be talking about each of these guys as we lead up to the NFL draft. Caleb Williams, of course, from USC, Drake May from North Carolina. They definitely are the ones that are dominating the conversation at this point. Now, that said, I do not believe that the Seahawks are very likely to be using a top 10 pick. I have a top 10 pick in next year's draft, and I certainly don't expect that to be the case at the quarterback position. I, however, do have real reservations about the interior defensive line play, as we have talked so many times before. That's where I think that folks should be paying attention, because as you said, Corbin, and I think very astutely, sir, Draymond Jones was nowhere to be found yesterday, and you paid him all this money. They have to get more impact plays out of him. And basically, it was, that was, to me, the most concerning outcome of this game, other than the injuries long-term. If they're long-term injuries, that's frightening. But Draymond Jones apparently is healthy and still gave you absolutely nothing. And so that, to me, is again, a very, very disturbing start to the season.
And our last question here, coming from Justice J on YouTube. How much accountability does Pete Carroll have for the constant slow starts on defense year after year? Is the way they handle preseason part of the problem? So let me tackle the first part of that question real quick. He has got to be held accountable because he is the head coach and he is a defensive coach. And this is a chronic issue where they can't get stops on third down. They miss tackles. They have coverage breakdowns. And against the Rams, I don't know how many times Sean McVay has to do the same thing over and over again. Now, they were running a little different formations, and as Bobby Wagner is saying, they spread them out a little more than they have in the past yesterday, but it was still a heavy diet of crossers 15 to 20 yards down the field, and they were just torching the Seahawks, and they can't figure out how to adapt to that. And so you're going to look at the defensive coordinator, Clint Hurt, there. But, I mean, Pete Carroll, you're the head coach and you're a defensive coach. He's got his hands on that stuff. So you have to be able to make adjustments. So I do think that there's a lot of accountability there. He's not the only guy that has involvement there. Your defensive coordinators, I mentioned Clint Hurt, and your other coaches. I mean, the entire defensive coaching staff should be really unhappy and embarrassed about the way things played out yesterday in that football game. But I think the second part of that question is interesting because I've talked about this before, and I know league rules have changed it, but like, Seattle used to at least get out those track pads, and they used to do some tackling drills where they would tackle guys on top of those pads. I don't think I saw that once this year. I have some questions about the way that they prepare the last several years. I mean, they have a pretty non-contact driven training camp, and there are other teams out there like the Detroit Lions that are playing this week that are the opposite. Detroit's going to really push that envelope, how much contact that they can have. And all these teams that are doing these scrimmage practices where they're bringing in joint practices with other teams. Seattle's one of the few teams that doesn't do that. So I don't know how much that weighs into the slow starts, but I think it is something to consider now that this has been going on for several seasons. Coming up next, we are going to be dishing out our Monday musings, looking back at yesterday's loss to the Rams. What stood out to us? What did we learn on offense, defense, and special teams? We'll get to those takeaways coming up next year on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks, which is brought your way by our friends over at FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can be in on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. You're listening to our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It's your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in and make Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. It'll be Telling the Truth Tuesday tomorrow on Locked On Seahawks. Maybe some hard truths coming out of this first game, a loss to the Rams, and maybe some positives, some silver linings. Maybe we'll have some of those coming up next year in this segment as well. You won't want to miss it. Make sure you're tuning in to tomorrow's episode before we turn the page to the Detroit Lions. It's time for our Monday musings, Rob. We've had a chance to go back and look at the film, and unfortunately, we had to watch that ugly second half. Again, in my case, I watched it 3 times doing a bunch of charting and stuff, but sometimes you get more value from watching these losses like this because there's a lot of lessons to be learned coming out of this football game, especially with it being week 1. So I'm going to give you the mic as always first, sir. And what's the first thing that jumps out to you when we look back at this game and revisiting the film, having a chance to really reflect on what happened in this 30-13 loss to the Rams?
Well, Corbin, I appreciate that. And, one of the things that you said is that you basically dove in. You looked closer at the game. I try to take a step back and look at all of the NFL. And so to me, one of the real storylines here is I think that you have to kind of just manage the expectations factor. And I'm going to try to give you some perspective, give our listeners here a little bit of perspective. I'm going to mention 6 quarterbacks that signed for big time dollars this season or were selected in the first round of the draft. So Joe Burrow, Daniel Jones, Geno Smith, Bryce Young, of course, number 1 overall pick, CJ Stroud, number 2 overall pick, Anthony Richardson, number 4 overall pick. They were 0-6 in week 1. Huge expectations for all of those quarterbacks. Now, I'm going to mention 6 other quarterbacks that were basically kicked around a little bit. They were either kicked off of their old club or they've been just blasted in the media or by fan bases, and they were 6-0. And we're talking about Derek Carr, Baker Mayfield, Brock Purdy, Matthew Stafford, Jordan Love, Jimmy Garoppolo. Again, 6-0. I think that there is something to be said about the expectations of fans, of the coaching staff, but of the players themselves. If you have an entire offseason where you have been blasted, then you are going to focus like there's no tomorrow. And whereas some of these other guys who are feeling pretty good about themselves, and again, this is much more complicated than just the quarterbacks, but I do think we give the quarterbacks a lot of credit when they're successful. I think that sometimes they get maybe too much blame when they're not, but expectations just in general, there were an awful lot of surprises in week 1 of the NFL. And I would mention this as well, that the team that won the Philadelphia Eagles and the Kansas City Chiefs, of course, are the 2 teams that played in the Super Bowl a year ago. And a year ago in week 1, they both were victorious. But the teams that they played in the AFC Championship game, the Cincinnati Bengals, they lost in week 1 a year ago. The San Francisco 49ers, they lost a week ago. It's still just 1 loss. It was as ugly gets in the NFL, but still just 1 loss. Improve, that's critical. But you can make those improvements. Things can get a lot better. This is an awful long season. And so that's the biggest takeaway I would have here is just the power of expectations. As I mentioned before, the Seahawks, of course, won the opener a year ago against the Denver Broncos. Again, Russell Wilson was the quarterback that had all the hype. And I told you a year before the game even happened, once they traded Russell Wilson to the Broncos, the Seahawks were going to beat him. His head was going to get too big, and Geno Smith or Drew Lock was going to be the victorious quarterback in that game. Again, the value of expectations and how it can be very powerful, both a positive or negative way.
Week 1 is truly unpredictable. You just never know what you're going to get. There have been plenty of teams. The Arizona Cardinals had chances to win yesterday, and I don't know how many games the Cardinals are going to have any chance to win this year. So you just don't know what you're going to get in week 1. So from that standpoint, I agree with everything that you just said. But I'm also looking at the track record, and this kind of goes off of that question about the accountability factor for Pete Carroll and some of the other staff members on this football team. They are notorious. Last year was one of the few times that they started with a good defensive game, and we know that that didn't last very long. They were struggling mightily on defense the next several weeks. When they won 4 games in a row, the defense had a kind of a mirage where they played better, and then they fell apart towards the end of the season again. But this has been a long-term trend that we have seen. And I've also noticed another trend. Shane Waldron, I think he has a chance to be a head coaching candidate after this year, but I've been concerned at times by the inability to make adjustments after halftime. And I saw this in this football game. Now, I mentioned this in the first segment here on today's show, Rob. When you have two backup tackles in, it really does condense your playbook, especially in Seattle's situation. They couldn't drop back and throw the football. But I didn't feel like they did anything to really help those tackles. They kept them on an island. The first 9 plays without Charles Cross or Abraham Lucas, they had 2 tight end personnel on one of those plays, Rob. Will Dissly played 16 snaps the entire game. When you have one of those tackles go down, Will Dissly is basically an extra offensive lineman at the tight end spot. He should be playing almost every snap to try to help out Jake Curhan or help out Stone Forsythe. And yet, he wasn't out there for most of those snaps, or they only had one tight end in the field. I was baffled by that. That seemed like an adjustment that high school coaches would make in that situation. And on defense, I can keep mentioning it over and over again, but Sean McVay, when are you going to learn eventually? Like, we know what he's going to do. He's going to find different ways to dress things up to get there, but they're going to attack us with crossers. They're going to do it 15, 20 yards downfield. Make adjustments. And so that is my biggest concern coming out of this game, other than, of course, the tackle injury situation, but the lack of adjustments or the inability to make them. We saw it on offense yesterday's game without helping those tackles out, trying to make it that Geno Smith has a fighting chance. You can get by with 2 or 3 receivers running routes because of the talent they have there, but you got to protect him. And then defensively, I just felt like it was a very vanilla game plan, that they didn't make adjustments. They didn't help their pass rushers. They didn't help their secondary. And so that falls on the coordinators, in my opinion. And I think it's worthwhile, even though it's just one game. I agree with you on that. This is a thing that I've seen in multiple seasons now from different coordinators on this team. So that's why it is still alarming to me, even after one game.
No, and I think you make an excellent point about the lack of using the tight ends to help out those 2 tackles. I think that, as you said, I mean, basically that's high school level stuff, maybe even earlier than that. That surprised me that the numbers were that obvious, frankly. That especially Will Dissly, the best blocker of the bunch of them,
16 snaps.
Yeah, that's disturbing numbers when you know that it was a very winnable game at that point. The Seahawks should have just said, okay, let's kind of buck up and play a little bit of physical football. The Rams were absolutely taking it to you. They were the more aggressive physical team. That's why they won. I mean, it really is that simple sometimes. And again, you have the opportunity. You have these great tight ends. Use them. And so that is frustrating. And plus, you want to keep your quarterback upright. So that is definitely something I think that bears repeating here. And you kind of stole my thunder a little bit, because when we were talking about, our Tuesday takeaways and really kind of breaking it down and looking closer, that was one of the things I was going to look at, is how did Seattle use their tight ends? Apparently, they did not use them at all. One of the other things that I think is something that is kind of important here is, again, as you mentioned, with the lack of the tight ends, I was going to kind of make this analogy here that, again, just how important I think the tackles, and once the Seahawks lost them, then they really were kind of stuck. You drive a Dodge Charger. Corbin, I drive a Toyota Highlander, and it's a hybrid at that. If I punch it and you're walking down the road, after about a block, I'll probably catch up with you. I mean, there's just not any, really pickup speed to it. And that's what it felt like the Seahawks basically were trying to play, was like, if I was to try and race you with my Highlander against your Dodge Charger, the only way I'm going to get you is if I walk up there and like literally puncture the tires. And that's what it felt like happened to the Seahawks on offense, is their 2 tires on the outside had basically been punctured. And I know that's a clumsy analogy, but the point remains the same. Basically, they were spinning their wheels and not going anywhere. So I really thought that they should have used their tight ends more. And if nothing else, if you're not going to try and run the ball, if you're not going to use your tight ends, then at least throw the ball down the field to your dynamic playmakers and hope that one of them can make a play. And to me, that was one of the disappointing aspects of it, is we saw DK Metcalf making kind of questionable decisions on the field, certainly not becoming the playmaker that he that he's been paid to be. Jackson Smith-Njigba was almost as invisible as Draymond Jones was. And Tyler Lockett, of course, with the injury, there's some concerns there. But again, it just felt, to your point, that Shane Rawlton struggled to make any type of adjustments. And obviously, the Seahawks personnel didn't help their coaches either.
Yeah, and I'm glad he pointed out to personnel, because going to the defensive side of the ball, you didn't have Devin Witherspoon and you didn't have Jamal Adams. Now, everybody expected going into this game, hey, that's fine. We've got Trey Brown, we've got Mike Jackson, and we've got Julian Love, who we're really excited about. And in the defense of those players, everybody in the secondary was kind of put in a bad spot because there was no pass rush to speak of. Matthew Stafford was just sitting back there, chilling in his recliner, changing the channel, looking at all his different reads, and he was slinging the ball. I mean, he made some ridiculous throws in this game that Seattle, I think, had decent coverage, and it didn't matter because he was just wheeling and dealing. But there were also a lot of plays where you saw receivers getting separation and getting behind the corners and safeties. Quandre Diggs should have given up a long touchdown to Van Jefferson, and he dropped the ball. He got caught flat-footed there. Reek Woolen at the end of the game. Nakua, I think part of it is he was trying to come up to the run. He was expecting them to run the ball, so he got caught off guard. They ran a vert, and he got beat, but the throw was a little bit too far for Nakua to get to. That would have been a touchdown too, but they gave up a lot of big plays in this game, and that's what I was really disappointed about, because I thought Trey Brown had a miserable start for the Seahawks yesterday. I'm just going to be brutally honest in my assessment there. He gave up a 44-yard reception to Tutu Atwell. He had a killer missed tackle on Nakua on the opening touchdown drive that if he would have been able to get him down where he had him just short of the 10-yard line, there's a much better chance the Rams don't score a touchdown there. Instead, he ends up breaking the tackle, goes out of bounds on the 1-yard line. They punch it in the next play. He had a terrible defensive hands to the face mask penalty that negated one of their few third down stops, and the Rams ended up scoring a touchdown when that would have been a field goal at best on that drive. So he had a really tough game. Julian Love gave up a 31-yard catch to Tyler Higbee. He missed 2 tackles, gave up 5 receptions in coverage, had 1 pass breakup, so he at least had that working for him. And Kobe Bryant gave up 7 receptions in this game. I just felt like the secondary, aside from the fact that I felt like Reek Woolen played pretty well and Matthew Stafford didn't test him very often, but I thought the rest of the secondary, it was extremely disappointing. That was probably the position group with expectations that I had the most disappointment about. They weren't helped by the pass rush, but certainly that was something that really hurt them in this game, that they were giving up all those explosives, and really I just didn't see impact plays from that group at all in this football game.
Didn't see impact plays, didn't see any type of intensity. They came out after halftime flat as 3-day-old Sprite. I mean, it was just ugly performance. It was an embarrassing performance. And again, you are going up against a team, the Detroit Lions, that are even more physical than the LA Rams, and obviously are playing with confidence after beating the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs in their house. So I think that the Seahawks had better get themselves fixed on the offensive line, better get to playing physical Seahawks kind of football. Otherwise, this is looking like an 0-2 club really, really easily.
You can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, it's Tell the Truth Tuesday. We're going to be dishing out some words of wisdom, maybe some positive wisdom. There's certainly going to be some negatives as well coming out of this game. And we're going to turn the page looking at the upcoming opponents. You mentioned the hot Detroit Lions coming off a big win at Kansas City against the defending champions. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening in and enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.